Hi everyone, welcome. What you see here is a worm bin that I've been referring to as our castings boulders worm bin, because the bedding that this system started out with back on day one, 137 days ago now, the system's 137 days of age, was not your typical worm bin bedding of leaves or paper, cardboard, anything like that. It was actually stuff that came out of my collection of finished vermicompost. All the stuff that was unable to pass through my screen, all the stuff that got caught, the large chunk materials that I set aside as almost like reject material. And it was sitting around and I figured, well, gotta do something with this stuff. Either I would like go out in the yard and fill a hole with it or something, and it seemed like an interesting idea to try to give the worms a stab at doing something with it. So I took this entire container of these castings boulders, dumped them in here, and proceeded to adding a small population of worms to the material to occupy the space and to see what they could make of the material. Usually when I look at a batch of vermicompost, I imagine that the material probably still has a certain amount of nutritional value to it, because the worms are, I guess, able to re-eat their worm manure, because the stuff that they consume, like fresh decomposing matter, it goes through their system so quickly that a large portion of the material's nutritional value remains in it even after it's been digested and, pooped out, basically. So in a way, I imagine the material as already being a substance that has nutritional value baked in a way. Whether or not it was going to be a viable bedding material for the worms to want to occupy, I guess, was the thing that remained to be seen. So the original setup of the system included a little haven for the worms to be able to hang out in, a little bit of actual regular shredded paper cardboard type bedding material, and a feeding area, and then I just left it to the worms to decide if they want to venture out into the castings boulders or not. And eventually they did, and here and there you could see a few of them occupying the material out here. And now that we've transferred our layout here in this system to what I refer to as ping-pong feedings, which really just means alternating which side of the bin gets fed, going from one side to the other, I do wonder if we're just distracting the worms from spending time in and breaking down the castings boulders material by giving them a nice cozy spot to hang out in. Because this edge of the bin over here that was covered with plastic, the rest of it was covered with just paper bag. We put napkins in here, we put some strawberry, I think there was some radish leaves. So we gave them a really nice little feeding zone over here to hang out in. So it's no surprise that when you go rummaging through the rest of the bin, you find very few worms, and then over here is where you end up encountering the bulk of the system's population, enjoying the nice bedding and the yummy foods that were placed in here. So there were a couple coffee filters placed out on top as our coverings for the feeding zone, and napkins were used as the foundation onto which the food was placed. Seems like these napkins are actually holding up pretty good because they went in here as like a little clump, basically. So perhaps the outer surface that was exposed to worm traffic might have been nibbled a little bit. But then again, you almost have to wonder, is it the bedding that they're going to nibble on, or is it the delicious foods that you left for them? I think the estimated worm count of this system was 134 worms when we first started. More recently, I've just been referring to it as a round number of under 150. But after 137 days in service here, I do sometimes wonder if perhaps the worms have increased their population just based on the fact that there's space enough for them to expand their population into. It certainly does seem to me like we've got a pretty good size worm population living in here, probably more than 150 at this point. We have been bumping into cocoons a bunch here and there, so that's also a sign that there's reproduction afoot. Tell you, they sure do vanish out of view quickly, don't they? But they're almost all still in my hand, except for this little guy right here who fell off a moment ago. So if I were to just turn this thing over or shake it up, we would almost immediately see all those worms that were hanging out there. So we're gonna set them up with a similar feeding to what they got last time as far as the bedding goes, because I've got a couple more napkins that I'd like to use as the foundation for today's feeding. And like I mentioned earlier, the place for the feeding on this go around is just going to be moved over to the opposite side of the bin, and then it'll be up to the worms to find where the lovely food supply is, and they'll make their way over here just like they did last time over the past couple weeks to find the yummy food. And I don't think that they can necessarily sense it like, hey, I know where it is, I can smell it from here. I think they just kind of go on the roam. I think they just start roaming around looking for stuff, and when they stumble on something they like, then they hang out and stay there. So the other thing I want to do, like I did in previous check-ins, is to kind of recycle a lot of the old paper products that were in the feeding zone from last time. Nicely seasoned bedding type materials, a number of coffee filters, a few napkins, and then this way we've kind of eliminated the lure of this edge of the bin for them to want to stay in by removing all the nice bedding type materials. I guess theoretically serving as a motivation for the worms to maybe get up and start looking for a better place to hang out. So let's throw in a little bit more fresh bedding, and then in can come some of their food. So some of it is going to be this day's worth of coffee. Sprinkle that in there, and I suppose this coffee filter could even come in as a feeding zone indicator in a way. Last time I covered up with 2 coffee filters, and you know, something that's been getting neglected a little bit lately is my supply of grit. I was just thinking back to the last couple worm bin check-ins where I've just not even taken this stuff out or used any of it. So I figured let's get back in the habit of giving them some grit with their feedings, because there's always that backlog of accumulating eggshells, and it just seems to me like my collection of eggshells has grown so rapidly that I've not yet depleted my current supply of crushed eggshell grit. So I feel like I got to get on the ball with that. Alright, I suppose if we leave a few little scraps of paper back on the old feeding zone, it's not the end of the world. We don't have to go picking through here to get every last fragment of it. But that's just the way I've been doing it. I figured I'd try to be consistent from that point of view. But I think we've gotten the majority of it. So we'll cover up here to remove the temptation for me to keep trying to go back there to pick up some more similar materials. We'll just call that a done deal as far as the last feeding, and now today's new feeding can get the last little portion of, believe it or not, pumpkin that I've got here. So this pumpkin is already completely thawed out, and there's like a little puddle on the bottom of the plastic bag. So there's a good bit of moisture coming in with this portion of food. So let's just drain that here. Adding more moisture to this system is really probably not the ideal situation. I mean, last time we kind of recognized that the system was getting a little bit overly damp and muddy, and it was for that reason we took the plastic cover off, at least from covering the entire system, and left the system covered with only the paper bag. The plastic came back in just to cover the feeding zone, just to keep the moisture there. And then the paper bag was left to cover the rest of the material out here in such a way that it hopefully allows for a little bit of airflow, possibly a little bit of drying. And well, there I go. There's a really generous portion, if you ask me, of the grit. And now that we're almost at the finish line, I guess I could use these last few scraps of paper to wipe off the material on my glove. But I like the idea of covering up the feeding zone a little bit better than this, so I think we're going to follow suit with what we did last time. We used the coffee filter as a top cover, but I liked the way I had set it up with 2 coffee filters, so we'll grab another coffee filter from my little collection over here on the side that I have actually been making an effort to work down and deplete. So I even included some of these coffee filters in my last batch of bedding that I shredded. When I got the shredder out, I actually included a few of these coffee filters in my last batch of shredded paper and cardboard, and that's going to be our feeding right there. So last time when I finished here, I had no covers. I had removed the plastic. The idea was to simply leave it off, but then I changed my mind and then I brought it in to cover the feeding zone. I guess it's also a way to minimize the amount of odor coming off the system as far as a tempting, delicious food substance being there that might attract insects. So that was sort of the other reason I like the idea of covering up with it over here. And then the other thing that was sort of homework for me was to come up with a paper-based covering for here, and that's how this bag ended up becoming part of the system. So I almost ended up going to the sink with this little wormy on my glove, so we wouldn't want that to happen. And you know, before we cover up here, another thing that's not been getting a lot of attention is my Mosquito Dunks, and I do see a couple flying insects here and there. So even though it doesn't seem like a place where there's a chronic outbreak of them, I thought I saw a couple flying insects, so it did seem sensible to maybe include a little bit of countermeasures to try to make sure we don't end up with an outbreak here. So that's it for our check-in with the Castings Boulders system. Fun system, coming along pretty nicely, but we're pretty much done here. I've got a couple things to take care of getting cleaned up, put away, but I'm not going to waste your time with that. Before I go really quick, let me just say thank you. Thank you so much for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. That's always really appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. That's very much appreciated as well. All right, everyone, thanks so much for watching. Have a great day. Bye now.